This is the One Girl Revolution podcast, a podcast that highlights the stories of world-changing women and girls across the country. We hope that these stories inspire you, but even more so, we hope that these stories help you to see your own value, your purpose, and your power to change the world through your life. Every woman and girl is a One Girl Revolution. On this week's episode of the One Girl Revolution podcast, I welcome Lily Nichols, Registered Dietitian and Nutritionist, Certified Diabetes Educator, researcher, and author of multiple incredible books. Lily's work is known for being research-focused, thorough, and sensible, and she is truly changing the lives of women and their children through the work she does every single day. Lily is the founder of the Institute for Prenatal Nutrition. She is the co-founder of the Women's Health Nutrition Academy, and she's the author of 3 books, Real Food for Fertility, which she co-authored with our friend Lisa Hendrickson-Jack, Real Food for Pregnancy, and Real Food for Gestational Diabetes. Lily's best-selling books have helped tens of thousands of mamas and babies and are used in university-level maternal nutrition and midwifery courses, and they have even influenced prenatal nutrition policies internationally. I have followed Lily, her research, and her work for years, and it is such an honor to have her on the podcast, and I cannot wait to share her story and her incredible work with all of you. Here's my conversation with Lily. Lily, welcome to the One Girl Revolution podcast.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
I feel like this has been a long time coming. I've admired your work for such a long time, and I'm so excited to have you on the podcast. I found out about you a couple of years ago, actually. My sister Delia had read your book, Real Food for Pregnancy. She was single and just had stumbled upon your book, and then she ended up starting your non-official fan club by purchasing your book for literally every woman and girl that she knows. So birthdays, wedding showers. I received your book, Real Food for Pregnancy, at my wedding shower. And so anyways, she kind of turned me on to the great work that you're doing. And since she had told me about you, I just started following you on Instagram. And then I was so excited recently when I saw, well, I guess it was almost a year ago now, I feel like, when I had seen that you and Lisa Hendrickson-Jack were joining forces to release this new book, Real Food for Fertility. And we've had Lisa on this podcast a couple of times. And so anyways, I feel like it's a full circle moment to have you on. So thank you so much for making the time to be on today.
Yeah, I'm really happy to do it.
So I want to talk about Real Food for Fertility. I want to talk about Real Food for Pregnancy. I want to talk about all of the great work that you're doing. But before we get into that, this podcast is really about stories, right? It's about the story, the evolution of the person. And so I would love to rewind. And could you just share a little bit about your own life, your own story, maybe your early life growing up, and how you first became interested in health and nutrition?
Yeah, well, I grew up in a pretty health conscious household. You know, my mom didn't keep like soda in the house, and conversations about how different foods made your body feel great or not so great were kind of commonplace. So I guess it's kind of no surprise that I ended up in the nutrition field. I think I was a teenager when I decided, you know what, I think I want to explore this as like a career. I had some extended family members who were chefs, and I knew that that was a lifestyle that probably just, it sounded kind of miserable to work super long hours, super late, super exhausting. So even though I'd always been really interested in cooking and baking and all of that, I was like, I don't know that that's an avenue in food that I want to go into. But this whole concept of we can impact our health by what we eat was really appealing to me. And I thought when I went to school, I was like going to do something with reducing childhood obesity by revamping school lunches because the food in schools was so terrible. And so I thought I'd go into public policy or in that arena. And interestingly, full circle, I kind of do have an impact on childhood obesity rates, but through a completely different avenue. So I went to school, got my dietetics degree, did my internship, got my RD. And it was sort of by accident that I ended up in the perinatal space. An opportunity came about to work for the California Diabetes and Pregnancy Program, which does a lot of work with gestational diabetes. So suddenly I was kind of working at a public policy level just focusing on pregnancy health, not necessarily childhood obesity, but it was there that I learned that a mother's blood sugar levels can impact her baby's future risk for becoming obese or diabetic quite substantially, like a 6 to 19-fold increased risk of developing type 2 diabetes or becoming obese by the time they're teenagers. So it was like kind of a light bulb moment for me that like, whoa, this is a two birds with one stone area that we can make a really big impact. It's a group of clientele who is the most motivated that they're ever going to be at any other time in their life. And yet when I was working clinically, implementing those guidelines, ironically, I found that they didn't work very well for helping my clients' blood sugar control and actually made them worse. And so that really lit a fire under me to figure out like, where do these guidelines go wrong? Where do they come from? What's the evidence behind them? And what's the evidence for doing something that actually works? So that was the whole impetus for my first book, Real Food for Gestational Diabetes, was trying to get better information out to moms and clinicians to improve those outcomes. And then it's kind of just sort of snowballed from there. I mean, that first book, I really just wrote it because I was so tired of hearing from women getting poor advice and hearing from other healthcare practitioners giving poor advice, that I was like, I need to put this all in one place with like the evidence behind it. And it just felt like the best way to do that was in a book with research citations. I didn't expect it to really become like a popular book. So that definitely took me by surprise and has led me to really the rest of my books. So Real Food for Pregnancy, people were asking for that book for a long time. I like this book you have on gestational diabetes, but do you have anything on general pregnancy nutrition? And I mean, I looked at the books on the market and it was all spouting the same outdated kind of information. I was like, oh my gosh. Like I thought I tackled all this in Real Food for Gestational Diabetes. I kept being like, just read the gestational diabetes book, but don't obsess about your blood sugar so much. It's really the same thing. And then I went through my first pregnancy and experienced firsthand the bad advice, all the controversies around what you can and can't eat. And I was like, okay, this actually is enough for it to be its own book. So Real Food for Pregnancy came about. I started writing that when my firstborn was about 10 months old, hence why there's a very long chapter on postpartum recovery in it. And then, since then, I mean, there's a laundry list of book suggestions that people send me. It's like, I don't think people realize that the process that I go through for writing books is really intensive. It's not like you can just like, oh yeah, here's a book idea, just repackage all this information in this other book. Like, no, it's a multi-year process. It takes a lot of research. So Real Food for Fertility just came out this year, co-authored with my dear friend, Lisa Hendrickson-Jack. We joined forces to really try to tackle this very big and growing concern among couples of infertility, and even couples that don't necessarily have fertility issues, but want to have the best possible journey to conception. And this also affects your risk for pregnancy complications. Like it's all related. It's all a continuum, our nutrition and how it impacts us and the next generation. That was the biggest project of all. That took, 3+ years to write. But yeah, ultimately I find my work is kind of at this intersection of, conventional dietetics and nutrition, looking at the evidence behind guidelines or lack thereof, looking at new evidence for how can we do better. And I'm always looking towards how can we optimize, right? As a clinician working one-on-one with people, you're always meeting people where they're at, and there is no perfect, right? But in my writing, I'm often writing for, okay, like assuming a perfect world, like what actually is optimal for the human body? And then within that, I do also try to like acknowledge that none of us are perfect and can achieve this optimal, but we're always trying to just like level up just a little bit to improve our outcomes, improve our hormones, our fertility, our menstrual cycle, our pregnancy, our postpartum journeys and breastfeeding journeys. All of this is about like, can you take that one little extra step to level up?
Yeah. And just the resources that your books are, you mentioned Real Food for Fertility and your other books as well, but I love it so much because it's almost like it's become my resource guide, right? If one of my friends brings up something, I'm like, oh, I know there's a section of the book. Let me look through there. And you quoted thousands and thousands of studies in this book, and I know with your other books as well. And it's really knowledge is power for all of us, but especially with women, so many things are interconnected. And I know I'm preaching to the choir with you, but we go to the doctor and the doctor is trying to put like a Band-Aid on something when in reality, it's like, well, maybe it's a nutritional thing, maybe it's something that we should cut out of our diets. I know myself and everybody who listens to this podcast has heard about my own journey where I've like cut gluten and dairy and other things because it was inflaming. I was getting eczema. And so just being able to like ask questions and connect the dots and have resources like the books that you have, but also just the resource that you are, Lily, following you on Instagram and being like, oh, hey, you got this question, and then talking about it. But the reality is each of us are individuals, right? Bio-individuality. And we have to be the ones that kind of are the puzzle piece putter together, the people that are like asking the questions, putting the pieces together. I know even when I talked to Lisa, we were laughing about like different times that I've gone to like my OBGYN. And I think every woman out there that's done charting can relate to this. Go to your OB and tell them like, oh, let me show you my charts and this is what's going on. And they kind of roll their eyes. Same as like in nutrition, like, hey, I stopped eating gluten and I noticed this. And they're kind of like, oh, whatever. So it's so important for us to really take ownership of our health and our fertility and pregnancy, all the different things that you mentioned.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think all of us have faced this being dismissed with healthcare providers. I know I'm probably not the easiest patient because I ask for, extra labs and decline certain things and, ask for certain things that other people don't. Or, sometimes, I've had experiences where I ask for certain lab tests to be drawn and they draw the wrong test. I've written about this before. I wanted my vitamin D levels checked at a certain point in one of my pregnancies, and they had already checked it earlier with the appropriate lab. And then they randomly, this next time they order it, they ordered the wrong type of vitamin D lab and called me that like my vitamin D levels were toxic. And I was like, wait, what? Like, let me look at the full results here, And I'm like, oh my gosh, you ordered the wrong form. And now let me give you a little education about vitamin D metabolism in pregnancy, because guess what? I teach like a 2-hour webinar about vitamin D in pregnancy. And I can tell you why the one that you measured is not the right one to measure, but also why it came out so high, because it does come out high in pregnancy. Now, please, could you reorder the correct lab? I've had so many experiences like that when dealing with the medicine space. And I really have to sympathize with people who are trying to navigate it when you don't necessarily have as deep of a knowledge base, because it's like, you really have to be on your game to catch errors. And I don't say this to suggest that there's like, just bad clinicians out there. I just think they're so overworked and sometimes not aware of certain research that it's just if it's not in their day-to-day, chances are there could be some mistakes made. So you really, we do try to educate to make sure people know what to ask for, how to ask for it, why to advocate for it, because it can be so challenging.
Yeah, it's so important too. And I'm realizing this at the stage in life that I am, that it's so important for women, especially, I would say for everyone, but specifically women, for us to build our army. So it's like, all right, if you work with a nutritionist, great. Or find a nutritionist that you can work with. You have your OB, but like, who are other people that you can go to ask for second opinions or just ask their perspective on things? And that's what I love so much about social media, even, is it's kind of given a lot of us easier connection to different people, where even when you, Lily, are doing like a Q&A, somebody could pop on there and be like, hey, my doctor said this, like, what do you think about this? Or asking questions like that, because we really need to build our army where we're not just gone are the days of where you had like one doctor that you go to for everything, because we need to ask these questions. And I think it's great that people are really starting to take that seriously. If you're enjoying this episode of the One Girl Revolution podcast, please subscribe today on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you listen to podcasts. We have a new inspiring episode coming out every single week, and you don't want to miss a single one. Subscribe to the One Girl Revolution podcast today. So, Lily, you talk a lot about real food. Those two words are in the headlines of your books, and you talk about it a lot. What does real food mean for people that are listening?
So my definition, and I say my definition because there's many different definitions out there, is that we're really referring to foods that have not been processed in a way that removes nutrients from them. So it's beyond the just shopping by, oh, I'll just buy, single ingredient items. Like, we have to be realistic here. Most of us are also buying things that come in packages with more than one ingredient, and that's fine as long as the ingredients in there, we understand what they are, right? But even for some of these single ingredient foods, oftentimes they have been processed in a way that removes nutrients. Not that they're then unhealthy, but now they're missing a part of the whole. So examples of this: buying a carton of egg whites at the grocery store. It's still technically a real food. There might not be any other added ingredients, but by taking out the yolk and not consuming the yolk, you're now missing out on a significant portion of the nutrients in there. Same as, purchasing a whole chicken and roasting a whole chicken versus only buying boneless, skinless chicken breasts, or dairy products and only buying non-fat dairy products and never having dairy fat. It just changes the micronutrients that you're consuming or not consuming. So when I think about real food, I think we're getting at not only this unprocessed whole food diet, but we're also not consuming things without their necessary whole parts with them. So I mentioned many different examples. I think most people, when they think of whole versus processed, they immediately go to the concept of refined grains, whole wheat bread versus white bread. And that's all fine and good, but I think we also need to expand that into other food categories as well. Because really the whole reason that people got all obsessed about taking the yolks out or the fat out or the skin off of the chicken and all of that was to avoid a nutrient or two that were demonized unfairly, your saturated fat or your cholesterol. And once you get over this concept that those two naturally occurring nutrients are somehow evil, then you can fully embrace eating real food.
Can you talk about how or why processed foods may be detrimental throughout pregnancy? I know you've written so much on this, and this is a big question, but just for people that are listening, can you explain why processed foods may be detrimental to pregnancy and fertility compared to whole foods?
Yeah, so it depends on which processed foods you're talking about and exactly how processed they are, right? So using some of the examples I just gave, egg whites are not going to be overtly harmful to you. You might be missing out on some of the nutrients in the yolk, right? But something like a high fructose corn syrup, as opposed to corn, that's so many more levels of processing that qualifies it as like an ultra processed food ingredient. As you get to things that have been ridiculously processed, where now it's not only missing some of the things that were originally in the food, but virtually all of the micronutrients are missing, and you're left with a pure refined sugar or starch or an overly processed like vegetable or seed oil or a trans fat, or just all the ridiculous flavors and chemicals and additives and things that they add to our foods to make them look and feel and taste better. I mean, better is a relative term, but you know what I mean? Like a bag of Doritos that has 1 million ingredients in it, they're engineered to taste really good, right? And make you want to eat more, even if it doesn't have the flavor of real whole food, right? As you get to those foods that have been what they call ultra processed, you're now taking in calories, but without the requisite nutrients that should be going with those calories. So you're getting energy, but you're getting empty calories. There's no nutrients to go with it. So the biggest concern is that as you consume more ultra-processed foods, you are consuming less micronutrients. And actually, like, the number one predictor of low micronutrient intake among pregnant women is the percentage of calories they're consuming from ultra-processed foods and refined carbohydrates. So the more of those you eat, the less nutritious things that you're eating, and that's an issue. Then you get into all the sort of metabolic consequences of eating that way. The majority of our added sugar intake comes from these ultra processed foods. More than 90% of our added sugar intake is from those foods. As you consume more and more added sugars and also just the refined carbohydrates, the white flour products, we're also changing our physiology in a very real way. Our blood sugar spikes a lot in response to consuming those foods. So now you're on this blood sugar roller coaster. That is in and of itself very inflammatory to your system. So that requires a lot of other resources, including nutrients, to kind of like tamp down the inflammation, try to keep the blood sugar as stable as possible. It also can affect your baby's development, because when babies are exposed to elevated blood sugar consistently throughout pregnancy, they grow and develop differently. Their pancreas grows larger, it produces more insulin, they store more fat in their system, less lean mass, more fat. Like they're literally can be born obese. And they have insulin resistance, which predisposes them to developing type 2 diabetes at a young age. I mean, up until the last few decades, we didn't see type 2 diabetes in children. They called it adult onset diabetes for a reason, because you really only observed it in adults. But we have metabolic dysfunction in children. And we know now that there's something called intrauterine programming, where their metabolism in their body is being affected by what they're exposed to in utero. So that can be the foods that mom is eating, or the chemicals she's exposed to, or her blood sugar levels, for example. There's many different factors, but all of that affects that child's development, the expression of their genes, and their risk for future disease. So those would be the major factors that I'm concerned about with ultra processed foods, is the lack of micronutrients, how it's displacing other whole foods. Typically, the more ultra processed foods, the more carbohydrates you're eating, but the less protein you're eating. The quality of fat consumed is usually poor quality fat that doesn't have the requisite fat soluble vitamins in it, but also tends to be really inflammatory. You're driving up maternal blood sugar levels. And then we also have to think about how that's affecting baby's development.
Yeah, and that leads me to real food for fertility. People, a lot of times when they hear the word fertility, they're like, oh, when I'm ready to start having kids, I'm going to then do all the things. And what I loved so much about this book is you talked about a lot of like fertility being preconception. So like there are things in our lives that we should be doing. And even to give another shout out to my sister who like buys your books for every single person she knows. I think that we should be like getting girls to read these books at an appropriate age, but teaching our teenagers and the 20-somethings about fertility, even having them read Real Food for Pregnancy and some of these things, getting them to ask questions and think about their own bodies, right? Because it's almost like we're running a race when you're talking about pregnancy or a marathon. It's like, all right, what are things that we can be doing to train our bodies? And to your point, just about these foods, like training ourselves now, even if you're listening and you're not trying to conceive, or, you don't even want to have kids, or whatever your story is, we can all be doing something to kind of start that path forward and say, all right, what are things that I can be doing? I don't have to just go cold turkey and cut everything, but what are things that I can be cutting, introducing into my diet, and really setting those habits for ourselves. And then that will lead to our children's habits too.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, it impacts all of it. You're affecting your baby's development, but also the habits that they're exposed to in the household influences how they're going to eat. What they're started on affects their taste preferences. What is offered at the dinner table, that affects what they're going to eat. I mean, I have 2 kids. I see it firsthand. Both of them have gone through picky eating phases, but which is developmentally, expected at certain ages. And then they come through and they just start actually liking and eating what you cook eventually. Like it does come full circle. But had they not been exposed to some of those more complex flavors from an early age, or just had the variety of things offered at the table on a regular basis, then the likelihood that they're going to like those things is slim. I mean, I even think about it myself. Like I mentioned earlier, I grew up in a pretty health conscious household. But my mom like doesn't really like fish, just like it tastes too fishy. She doesn't really know how to cook it. So we didn't really grow up eating that much fish. It was a very occasional rare item on the menu. And so since I didn't grow up eating it much, I didn't really develop a taste for it. And it wasn't until I was living in a place where there was a lot of fish around, I lived for a couple of years in Alaska, that it was like, oh, I need to learn how to cook this fish because there's so much fish around. It's basically free food. It's like once you pay your fishing license, it's free, right? It's like the best quality food you can get. Everything else at the grocery store is so expensive and it's so hard to get like good fresh food up there. But this seafood, here it is right in front of you. I had to learn to cook it. And you find that, oh, actually, this is quite delicious. But that was a taste preference that I had to develop at an older age. And that's hard when you're an adult trying to introduce new habits. It's a lot easier. You hear people who've grown up in other countries eating all the things, all the different parts of the animal, all these different spice and flavor combinations that seem weird and scary if you weren't exposed to it. But when you've had it your whole life, it just becomes the norm. So yeah, it makes a big difference.
What has the response been? I talked to Lisa a couple of months ago, right when the book was coming out, and now here we are a couple of months later, Real Food for Fertility. What has the response been from women, about this book, and what are you hearing from people that have read it?
Well, yeah, it's been out 6 months now. Honestly, Lisa and I expected maybe in like a year's time, we would start hearing some of the miracle stories. Like, oh my gosh, I finally got pregnant after like all these years of infertility or whatever, because it does take time for your body to respond to changes. But we were honestly floored that within like a month, we were getting those sorts of stories. So both of us received messages to our inboxes really on a daily basis of improvements to health, women who have overcome infertility, maybe couples who they had no idea about, the sperm quality parameters and how those are really set at such a dismally low level that they're set to identify overt infertility in men, but there's like this subfertile category of like sperm quality is not that great, might prevent you from getting pregnant as easily, but we don't call it abnormal by the current guidelines. So we've had women like, wow, we were able to apply the reference ranges that you laid out in your book from this newer research and found that my husband's like semen quality needed improvement. So we implemented all these things from chapter 9 and wow, it's improved. This is 30% better. That's 50% better. That's 20% better. And guess what? We just got pregnant. So we've heard just crazy stories. We even had a woman reach out who had primary amenorrhea. She's a high-level female athlete in college. Primary amenorrhea is when somebody has never had a menstrual cycle before. They've never bled, never had a period. And this happens to athletes who have like just really, really high energy expenditure and it's hard to consume enough food or the stress, or there's many different factors that can play a role in amenorrhea. We have a chapter on hypothalamic amenorrhea in Real Food for Fertility, and we make no claims about primary amenorrhea because that's like a whole separate, more complex scenario than somebody who's had a cycle, but it has gone away due to excessive exercise, under eating, stress, or any of those factors combined. But yeah, this woman had never had a cycle, so in her 20s, and within a couple months of implementing our advice, had her first period. And she's seen multiple specialists, has implemented all the typical advice. She was even studying nutrition, she had told me. And so she had been trying to do the things that are typically recommended for a female athlete. Eat, as much food as you possibly can, really focus on the carbs because you're burning so much, energy with your exercise. But she had been not eating enough protein and not eating enough fat because our nutrition guidelines and courses, having been through a conventional program, really teach you to kind of fear animal foods and fear fat. So it was a matter of getting the macronutrient balance in place. It sounds like she was already eating plenty of calories, but was under consuming fat and protein, which is what I've personally seen a lot in practice in these cases. And lo and behold, hormone production comes on board. and she got her first period. So yeah, that's just a smattering of stories, but it's been, yeah, we've been blown away by the response. It's absolutely wild.
Yeah. And like I said, I mean, this book is just filled with so much information that I really use it as a resource now. Somebody will tell me, like, oh, I have this issue or this issue. And just being able to go through and look up a specific issue, or, you know, you have chapters on like bigger chapters where you delve into bigger topics. And so I just encourage everyone to get it and just use it as a resource. And as you read it, there will be things that kind of are light bulb moments for you. I know that I've had those moments where I was like, and I'll give a shout out to Fullwell, the prenatal vitamin that you recommended, you and Lisa recommended. I was like, oh, I'm not really happy with like the vitamin that I had been taking, so I'm just going to try it. And Lily, I kid you not, within 2 months, my cycle changed completely, like in a positive light. I wasn't getting sick every single month. You know, and so even I posted about it the other day because I was like, oh my gosh, Fullwell has changed my life. And so little things like that, you have to, it's not going to necessarily work for everybody. You know, some of the things that you recommend, it's like, all right, well, people have to know their bodies and recognize things. But I just have learned so much by reading this book. And I know that anybody who reads it will find things that are these light bulb moments and helpful things for them.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Sometimes it is. I mean, there's so many different micronutrients that can play a role in our hormones and our cycles, that if you can get those dialed in, and with something like a comprehensive prenatal like Fullwell, you're really filling in all those potential gaps in the diet, for better or for worse. Most of us are not consuming a picture perfect diet every day. Moreover, even if you are, our food is just depleted of micronutrients relative to how it was decades ago. So a lot of us are, yeah, kind of running on empty. And to fill in those gaps, it can sometimes be the missing ticket, you know?
So, Lily, I know that you have done this work for so long. And so this is kind of a random question. And I did ask Lisa this as well. But in researching for this book, was there anything that surprised you, or things that you hadn't thought about before that you were kind of like, oh, wow, this is interesting? Or in some of the research that you stumbled upon, something that surprised you?
There was a lot of things that surprised me. It's hard to even like nail it down to one. I guess I can't say this was a surprise, but it was a disappointment that I came across so much blatant bias in the research, especially the research on animal food and meat intake relative to fertility. You hear all the time in the conventional space, you know, if you want to work on your fertility, reduce your meat intake. The meat is inflammatory. Too much protein's bad for you. The meat has toxins or hormones or other, there's all these like things thrown around about meat being terrible for your health. And first of all, I think what's important about a distinction maybe between real food for fertility and other resources, or just the difference between having a resource put together by clinicians who like research, but not just siloed researchers, is that we have real world experience working with clients and seeing firsthand what actually works, right? So from my perspective, working with clients with infertility, or working with clients during pregnancy and postpartum, running micronutrient analyses on their diets and seeing like, wow, when people aren't consuming meat, like they're oftentimes falling short on protein, yes, of course, but also falling short on a number of different micronutrients. Let's run some lab panels. Oh man, they're deficient in this. Let's add it back in, and wow, it's all improved. Or from Lisa's perspective, working with clients very specifically on their cycle and being like, okay, I seem to see this pattern among like the vegetarian or the low meat eating clients, and let's add some animal protein in, and whoa, the cycle has normalized. Look at that within a couple of months. Like from both of our perspectives, we kind of know what works. But so diving into the research where you find a study that says meat is bad for ovulatory function, for example, you're like, okay. And then you dive into the actual study on it. And sometimes the title of the study, the abstract of the study, even the overall conclusions of the study are not reflective of the actual findings of the research. So I cite a couple of examples of this in chapter 5 is all about vegetarian diets, and there's a section called "Is Meat Bad for My Fertility?" or something like that. And one of the studies I'm thinking of in particular, the title of the study alluded to plant protein being protective of fertility and animal protein being overtly harmful with relation to ovulatory function. And you look at their data tables. Now, thankfully, the study actually included their data, because sometimes they don't include the data for you to do secondary analysis. But you looked at the odds ratios of anovulatory cycles, and lo and behold, red meat was not harmful to the cycle. Not all animal protein was harmful to the cycle, by the way. In fact, surprisingly, processed meat, of all the different proteins they looked at, processed meat seemed to be most supportive of ovulatory function. Explain that one. They didn't, by the way. But you look at the plant protein options, I think they had broken it down into nuts and seeds, meat alternatives, and legumes and beans. And the legumes and beans were indeed supportive of healthy ovulatory function. But you looked at the other two categories of plant protein, those actually scored some of the worst for ovulatory function. So the title of the study was a complete mismatch to the data described. They really did not show that meat was harmful to ovulatory function at all. And it was a misrepresentation to say plant protein as a whole is beneficial to ovulatory function, because the meat alternatives, those like fake meat products, that scored some of the worst. So that was a big frustration of mine. I knew that bias against meat existed in the research. It always has, but it was shocking to see just how bad it was. Like it was really quite bad. I'm just going to give you that one example. There's many more, but that shocked me. That paper should not even have gone to print, in my opinion.
That's the important thing for all of us, though, is to do our research, do our due diligence, ask questions, look up different things. And I don't know if it's because of social media, Lily, or what it is, or what's going on in our world where people seem to be more open to asking questions. And even, there's more of a dialogue about focusing on meat. So you have like the ancestral supplements that people are starting to do. And then even with fertility, like asking different questions. That's why I feel like the timing of this book is so perfect and poignant, because there is this, I don't know if it's like not to call it a revolution, because this is the one girl revolution, but it just seems like people are starting to ask questions, advocate for themselves. And looking back, us growing up in the times of the food pyramid, and it's like, now it's like, wait, what? Like they're telling us to eat all of this processed food in the biggest thing. And even myself as a little kid, I had terrible eczema and doctors couldn't figure out what was wrong. And then it was my mom that started cutting things out. She became super crunchy, was going to a local food co-op and cutting additives out before the days of Whole Foods. And she was the one that pretty much cured my eczema, because she started asking those questions. But now I see this openness amongst people, especially once they kind of hear from someone like you and they're like, oh, maybe I should ask this question, or maybe I should read this book, and maybe I should try this thing. But there seems to be an openness in the culture and in the world where people are starting to really advocate for themselves.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's a little more mainstream these days. It seems as though all these there's these like fads that that pass through the population. And I mean, I'm honestly all for people trying out different ways of eating, because I think there's different ways of eating that work for different people. So I think some of these things that are labeled as fad diets really do truly have their place for some people. But having grown up, in the era of low fat everything, I mean, even my parents, who were just trying to do their best, they were not immune to all of that. Thankfully, we didn't like cut out butter out of the household or egg yolks or something, but we didn't have red meat in my house growing up. We'd occasionally get burgers out, but like I was probably pretty anemic. Like, looking back, just how hungry I always was. I mean, I realized in my 20s that I probably had dealt with reactive hypoglycemia for most of my life. I was one of those people who had like emergency snacks in her purse, like at all times, because you're going to be hungry. And it was all the carbs and not enough protein. And now, like, having pretty much eaten this way now for the last like 20 years of my life, I can tell like the days in which I don't get my like protein dialed in at breakfast. It's like, man, I really feel crappy today. I'm so hungry. Oh, I'm so low energy. I'm snapping at the kids. And it's like, of course, I like didn't do what I should have done. And this is the consequence. And it's not to feel blamey or shamey or guilty or anything like that, but it's a good reminder, you know, of what works and what doesn't work. And I do think we're hitting that phase now. I think there was a period of time where vegetarian and veganism got really popular, and there was that explosion of all these plant-based meat companies, and a lot of those companies are going under. I mean, we saw it during the pandemic, right? You'd have like the meat would all be sold out, and then you have like all the Beyond Burgers sitting there that nobody's buying, you know. I think it's swinging a little bit the other direction, slowly but surely. So we'll see how it plays out. But I mean, the industry has to respond to consumer demand, and the consumer demand really is for regeneratively raised quality meat, quality animal proteins these days. And we need that shift, not only for our health, but for the environment too.
Watch our Emmy-nominated documentary series featuring the girl inside and in tandem on our website or on our YouTube channel today. Check out onegirlrevolution.com. That's the number onegirlrevolution.com today. And please subscribe to our YouTube channel for our documentaries, videos, and podcast episodes. Lily, what do you wish that more people understood about the connection between nutrition and diet and reproductive health? I know that's a big question, and there's probably a lot of different ways you could go about that, but I guess what's one thing or maybe a couple of things that you wish more people understood?
Well, I think first acknowledging there is a connection whatsoever would be great, because there's a lot of people who seem to think that what you eat has nothing to do with your risk for infertility or your menstrual cycle, ovulation, how well your body will respond to fertility treatments, whether your AMH levels will shift based on a dietary or nutritional change. Like there's a lot of individuals who are very dismissive of any connection whatsoever. So first of all, I would love that people would even acknowledge that there's a connection. Second, I would say, I think we need to get a lot better at paying attention to the signals that our body is giving us about our food and lifestyle choices, like building in mindfulness into part of this. So I've often talked about mindful eating at length with people, because I really encourage, yeah, you have to have some nutritional common sense, of course, but there's a mindfulness component, right? The like, oh, I feel like garbage this day. Oh, it's probably because my protein intake was not adequate. That's a mindfulness component. You're tying it back to some nutritional common sense, but I'm acknowledging my body does not feel well when I do X, Y, Z, and this helps me fine tune, you know, my diet to better work for my well-being, because different people might need different amounts of protein or different timing of meals, or they might need a snack or they might not need a snack. And that can vary day to day based on so many different factors. And likewise with our fertility and our menstrual cycle, tying in like the charting component, that kind of serves as a point of mindfulness of, okay, I've observed these changes in my menstrual cycle as a result of making these changes. Maybe I cut out alcohol this cycle, or I cut back on caffeine, or I increased my protein intake, or I started eating a salad before my lunch instead of a bag of chips or something, I don't know. Or I've started waking up a little bit earlier and going to bed a little bit earlier, or putting up light blocking curtains or wearing blue light blocking glasses in the evening. And like these things all do have an impact, but you only see that impact if you're really paying attention and building in that mindfulness part. So I think those would be my two things. Acknowledge there's a connection first and foremost, and then pay attention to how that actually plays out for you in real time.
Well, and again, I'm going to post the links for all of your books so people can easily get them. And I just encourage people to get them, use them as a resource, read them, of course, but just have them around that you can look back at if someone brings something up to you or you're experiencing something yourself that you can go through and be like, hey, I'm dealing with this. Let me see what it says. Lily, we have some really great questions from our listeners. So last night, like I shared with you, I had posted on Instagram and said, hey, Lily and I are going to be having a conversation. Let me know what you're thinking about. And so we got some great questions. So I'd love to just pass them along to you and see what you have to share. The first one here is there seem to be so many more women struggling with infertility than in the past. Why do you think that is?
Well, pick your reason out of a hat. There are so many different reasons. Our lifestyles are not at all aligned with the rhythms of the seasons and the day. We're not waking up with the sun. We're not going to sleep when the sun sets. We are eating differently than we ever have before. Completely different macronutrient ratios than probably all of human history. We are behind screens most of the day. We're not out in the sun. That affects our vitamin D levels, but also a number of different hormone levels. We're not as active in the way that we used to be active, which was not like going to the gym 3 times a week, but activities built into our day-to-day life. We just don't move as much during the day. I think our food quality plays a major role. We, since the 70s or so, have had hormonal contraceptives as an option, and that does play a role in our fertility. I've got a whole chapter on that in Real Food for Fertility, right? But that can, from a nutritional perspective, deplete certain nutrient levels. Physiologically, you're shutting down hormone production for the time in which you're taking it. And once you come off of it, there is a delay in the return of your cycle. Your ovaries have to come back online and start producing hormones again. And that takes a while. So if you're expecting to conceive immediately when you come off of hormonal contraceptives, it might be interesting to read through some of the data on how long on average it takes women to get their cycles back. Some do get them back right away, but for many there's a delay of several months, and in some a year or more, depending on how long they've been on them. Environmental toxins, I think, are also a major one that I didn't mention. There's a whole bunch of toxins in our environment that were not necessarily in them previously. I mean, the industry is constantly pumping out new chemicals every year, and not all of them have safety information available. So as the new chemicals come out, how many years does it take for them to get reproductive toxicology studies done? I mean, it took decades with BPA, and they came out with all sorts of BPA alternatives, and those are understudied with regards to fertility. But what comes out about them is not at all reassuring. A lot of it mirrors exactly the things that were happening with BPA. Just because you tweaked one little teeny thing on the, chemical structure of the molecule doesn't suddenly make it completely safe for humans. We just don't have the data on it yet. So I think that's another major one, whether we like it or not. There's a lot of toxin exposure. Some of it's within our control. We do highlight a lot of those in the toxins chapter of Real Food for Fertility. And then some of them, inevitably and unfortunately, they're simply in our environment. I can't control that I live close to, a farm field that has airplanes that spray pesticides on it every few weeks. Like, I can't control that. I can't stay inside when it happens, but there's some low level exposure that is simply there. So I think it's really it's tricky to try to pinpoint, it is precisely this one thing that is affecting fertility, because I think it is so many things. And also to note that it's your partner too. We focus so much on the woman, but we're not always talking about your partner. And semen quality can also take a hit, similar to how female fertility does. And one other factor, just for completeness sake, many of us are delaying starting our families until later in life. And fertility does naturally decline over time. I mean, people don't like to talk about this because it is an uncomfortable fact of life. And it's not like suddenly your egg quality just drops off a cliff at 35 or something, but there is a gradual decline in egg quality and ovulatory function and hormone production as you get older for women, as you approach menopause. And so that is simply a fact of life that we also have to acknowledge. You're likely going to be more fertile in your 20s than you are, in your late 30s or early 40s. And that is something that is just a physiological reality.
Yeah, well, and I know that you talk about resources even for that, and supplements is just things that we can do in those situations. So again, people should get your book no matter what they're going through and be able to use it as a resource. We have a listener who would love for you to talk, which kind of leads to what you were sharing just about the pesticides and herbicides and those. We have a listener who would love to have you talk about the effects of glyphosate, which is a herbicide that can kill certain weeds and grasses, which I know is just, I feel like everywhere these days.
Yeah, glyphosate is the most widely sprayed herbicide worldwide. I am unfortunately surrounded by neighbors who all spray their yards with glyphosate and fields that are all sprayed with glyphosate. It is what it is. Yeah, it's an unfortunate reality that tons of glyphosate's usually sold in the product Roundup. You'll see it at, your Home Depots and Lowe's and all your hardware stores. It is a very pervasive chemical. It does affect fertility. We have a whole section on glyphosate within the section on pesticides in the toxins chapter because it does deserve special mention. We do have data that it can affect reproductive hormone levels, ovulatory function. I even talk about it in Real Food for Fertility, or Real Food for Pregnancy, rather, affecting various risks of pregnancy outcomes as well, placental function, embryonic development. It affects semen quality. So this is a herbicide you want to try to avoid if at all possible. Like I said, I'm surrounded in my environment, so I try not to go outside on the days when neighbors or farms are spraying. That said, I don't spray Roundup in my own yard, and I try to purchase organic for the items that tend to be the most widely sprayed with Roundup. So genetically modified corn, soy, canola tend to be the most highly sprayed because they literally have been modified to the plant will survive the spraying of the herbicide, which otherwise would kill everything it comes in contact with. So those tend to have the highest pesticide residues for this particular herbicide. So I'm not a huge fan of soy, but if you are consuming soy, organic soy only, I would actually be quite strict about that. Other plants other crops that tend to be highly sprayed include your grains and legumes. So for beans, wheat, flour, lentils, all of those, I would buy organic if at all possible. So, I make my own sourdough and I buy organic flour in bulk because I can't get organic flour at the local grocery stores that are near me. So I might be a little extra, but also just if you're buying pre-made bread on the shelf, I'd be buying organic bread made with organic flour. For beans and legumes, 100% would be buying organic as much as I can. That would probably be the majority. I guess the other place you can get it, of course, would also be the oils that are made from those crops, which I don't really highly recommend seed oils as a whole. But if you're using soybean oil, cottonseed oil, canola oil, it'll be concentrated in the oils as well. So if you happen to be using those, buy organic, but I personally would recommend different, better quality, less inflammatory oils as a whole. So yeah, we just got to do the best that we can. Hopefully me sharing that I live by farms and neighbors that all spray gives people a little peace of mind. I also try to take every effort that I can to support my body's ability to detoxify, because it is working even harder than it should to have to detoxify those things. So we do have a section in the toxins chapter going through many different options for helping your body to detoxify, but just a handful of things that I really prioritize are getting enough protein, especially protein that contains glycine and cysteine, which is primarily your animal proteins, by the way. These will give you the raw materials for producing glutathione, which is your body's major detoxification enzyme. Also consuming enough selenium, which you get also in those animal foods, but especially seafood. And also if you add in Brazil nuts as an option, that boosts your selenium intake. That's used to help you detoxify. So I really try to prioritize those, including plenty of fiber from whole foods, helps your body to bind and excrete things via your stool. just staying super well hydrated, consuming enough minerals and electrolytes. I mean, having like a good nutritional foundation helps all of these detox systems work better. Because again, the inevitability is like we live in a toxic world. So we have to take, not only precautions to avoid exposure, but just help our bodies handle the inevitable exposure.
Yeah, and we can't live in fear, right? We can't hide ourselves away, like live in a basement and live in fear. And I know there are so many scary things in our world today, and the temptation is like, oh my gosh, so and so is spraying their lawn, like I can't ever leave my house. But it's like, to your point, it's like, all right, what are the things that we can control in our own lives, and what are things that we can do? All right, if someone's spraying, like I'm not going to go around that. Or if I know someone's sprayed, I'm not going to go in their grass, I'm going to stay away from those areas. And even for little kids, right? Like they shouldn't be around that. So making sure that our kids are just aware. You don't want them to be fearful of,
Totally.
Miss Neighbor's grass because
I mean,
it,
the stress of it can make people go crazy. And that's the thing where you have to I do a lot of like level setting with people, like, okay, there's this exposure, which is not great, but like, how can we just mitigate this, but also not lose our minds over it? Because I think, we have a physiological response to stress too. That in itself is inflammatory. So if we're living in fear and freaking out about every little thing, or trying to control our lives so much that we can't even live normally, that does not serve you well either. So there's a middle ground. Hopefully that's came across.
yeah, that's great. A couple of quick questions here from listeners. What's the best ovulation testing kit that you would recommend? And second part of that question, people with PCOS or other hormonal disruptors, do you recommend the same or a different kit?
Speaking to brands of ovulation predictor kits is probably outside of my area of expertise, but I will say this, the typical ovulation predictor kits are testing for a surge in luteinizing hormone, which is the hormone that surges before ovulation to trigger ovulation. They don't confirm, they try to predict ovulation. So I hope I'm speaking for Lisa accurately here, but we're of the opinion that they can be used, but should be used in conjunction with tracking your other fertile signs, such as like you can use basal body temperature to confirm that ovulation has indeed happened, because you'll see a rise in your basal body temperature. And for your cervical mucus, you will no longer see cervical mucus after ovulation has happened. Typically, I'm sure there's exceptions to the rule, but if you rely solely on luteinizing hormone kits, it can be a little tricky, especially for women with PCOS, because they often experience like their body's trying to ovulate many, many times in their cycle, and it's delayed. It doesn't happen. So they often have multiple LH surges. So if you're using an OPK that is an LH only strip, it may look like you've ovulated a bunch of times in your cycle. You can only ovulate one time during your cycle. So you would want to be using those in conjunction with tracking signs and symptoms like cervical mucus. So that's the tricky part of using LH strips. And I do believe we have a little section in the PCOS chapter of Real Food for Fertility that talks about some of those considerations and some of the specific things you'd want to employ if you have PCOS for cycle tracking, because it can be a little trickier to predict ovulation. It's still confirmed via the same way, but it's trickier to predict because of that.
That makes sense. So last question here from our listeners, perimenopause. I know we're talking about fertility, but do you have any recommendations for women who are going into that stage of life? I know that I mentioned Fullwell, and this question actually came out of when I had posted about the Fullwell prenatals. Someone reached out and was like, oh, well, I'm perimenopausal. Could I take those supplements? Do you have any recommendations for someone in that stage?
Yeah, you definitely could still take them. I think, it is a fairly high potency multivitamin, prenatal vitamin. So whether you need like a full dose probably depends. I mean, really kind of the purpose behind the formula, and I don't want to speak for Ayla, who runs Fullwell, but I think the purpose behind the formula is for supporting women in the preconception, pregnancy, and postpartum stages. Not to say that you can't also take a high potency multivitamin at a later stage. I just feel less confident saying across the board, yes, everybody needs this super high potency one when they're perimenopausal. If you're pretty nutrient depleted, or maybe you were on hormonal contraceptives for many years, you've tested low in micronutrients, maybe you were vegetarian or vegan for a long time, yeah, you probably do need a pretty comprehensive high potency one, at least for a period of time. So yes, you could definitely consider that, adding that, or sometimes people will do a partial dose. So that's, it's comprehensive because it's an 8 capsule a day formula. So some people can do like 4 capsules a day, just keeping in mind that you're getting a half dose of all the nutrients on that list. So there may be some things you want to supplement extra. You could work with a practitioner to better define what extra supplements you might need if you take that course. But as for general perimenopausal support, and yes, people have requested a book on menopause, let me recover for a couple years from this book project to see if I ever want to take on another book project again. Not to be kind of a broken record, but a lot of the same overarching principles apply nutritionally for perimenopause, just as a lot of the same nutritional principles apply for, adolescent girls and young children and men optimizing their semen quality and just general disease prevention. Like, a lot of the same nutritional principles apply. Some of the things that I would be prioritizing even more in that transition is acknowledging that maintaining sufficient muscle mass is super, super key to handling that metabolic transition easily. So sufficient protein intake is absolutely vital. Sufficient fat intake so you can still have the raw materials to produce hormones. You want to be trying to produce your natural hormones as long as you possibly can. The protein intake also, though, would help with supporting your muscle mass, which you would also want to be supporting by doing weight-bearing exercise. I would also say focusing on blood sugar balance is a really big one. More often than not, insulin resistance tends to increase over time as we get older. So it becomes even more and more challenging to keep our blood sugar in a healthy range. And that helps a lot with this transitional period. So I would say optimizing your glycemic balance of your diet is even more important than maybe even than, in the 10 or 20 years prior to that. I find a lot of women do better on a pretty lower carb intake in the perimenopause stage, whereas during the fertile years, I'm kind of more like a sort of moderate or moderately low carb diet works well. But in the perimenopausal stage, a lot of women need to cut back a little bit more. And you can see whether you fall into this category or not by monitoring your blood sugar levels. You could get like a regular blood sugar monitor or a continuous glucose monitor and actually see how is your body handling your carbohydrate intake, because that may need to be titrated down. And if you do take that road of bringing your carbs down, you need to eat other foods in its place, not just starve yourself. And that's where eating more protein along with the fat that comes with it really comes into play there. I would consider that. And then, if you fall into the category where you think your hormone levels are really affecting your well-being, bioidentical hormone replacement therapy, I think, is something that can be looked into. There's a whole lot of different like herbal options that are out there as well. I recommend people check out the work of Dr. Aviva Ram. I mean, it's a natural transition. I think we should embrace it and not fight against it, but we can do things to help, support it to be a little easier.
Yeah. Well, Lily, thank you so much for all of that. I know we didn't get to all the questions, but I could sit here and talk to you all day. And I know everybody who's listening is like, I just want to keep following what Lily's doing. So I will be sure to post your Instagram and your social media pages, as well as your website, because I know there are opportunities that people could actually work with you. I know you do webinars. You, of course, have all these great books that I will be sure to link in the show notes so people can continue to follow what you're doing and stay in touch with you. I know that you do Q&As from time to time. So if people have other questions, they can hop on there and ask you those questions. But you're such a wealth of knowledge, and I've loved following you and loved having you on this podcast. But before I let you go, Lily, I always end this podcast on 2 questions. So I'll start with the first one. You are a one girl revolution. You are changing women and girls' lives all around the world and opening people's eyes to new things. But who is a one girl revolution in your life? Who is a woman or girl that inspires you?
I mean, I grew up watching a lot of cooking shows. I think that helped, get me excited about the whole food stuff from a very young age. So I'd have to give a shout out to like Julia Childs. She just kept it kept it real. She was hilarious. She didn't hold back. And such an inspiring woman, accomplished so much ahead of her time at a time when it was hard for women to get ahead in their careers. So yeah, I'll give a shout out to her.
The OG. I love her so much. And I still love watching all those like older videos of her. She's so hysterical.
She is. I love it.
All right. Last question, Lily. If you could leave women and girls around the world with one message, what would it be?
Don't be afraid of nourishing yourself. I think a lot of us are coming off of many decades of diet culture, and we have to push back against this deeply held belief that there's some sort of worthiness associated with going without, doing without, starving, being within a certain body size. We really need nourishment if we want to show up well in this space, in this world. If you want to do good things, you have to be well nourished. So eat your food, eat your protein, eat your meat with the fat. And yeah, show the world what you got.
Lily, thank you so much for being on the One Girl Revolution podcast. And thank you for all the incredible work that you do.
Thanks for having me.
For more from One Girl Revolution, to listen to all of our podcast episodes, watch our Emmy-nominated documentary series, follow us on social media, donate to our nonprofit organization, and more, please visit onegirlrevolution.com. That's the number onegirlrevolution.com.